Shalom, I'm Dr. Dina Dye with Foundations in Torah. Welcome back to this series of programs called Days of the Bones. I did allude to something last week. I want to draw your attention to it as well because it's going to become important as we get through the final couple of shows on this. The reason I even called it the Days of the Bones. And I just want to remind you of when Moses was going to carry Joseph's bones back to the land. Now, it took a while, but the significance was they carried it in, it actually says an aron or an ark, and to carry his bones back to the land, particularly to the place Ephraim, the region of Ephraim, that tribal allotment. That's where his bones were going to be buried. In the exact same, well, close to where Yehoshua was buried, and they both died at 110 years old, so it's significant. And I would just suggest that you listen to last week's program to get a little bit of the backstory there. But as we've moved forward, and we've been talking about the Levite being from Ephraim, serving at Shiloh, and now we are focusing a little bit of our energy here on the concubine, the Pilagesh. And who is she and who does she represent? Remember, I told you in our first session, none of these people have names. They're just kind of random people. So even though they don't have names, they have function. And that is something very key in the Bible because everything is really built around what is the function and purpose. So what is the function and purpose of this story? What is God trying to communicate to Israel about what's going on in this story? Again, it's an allegory, and they would have sat up and they would have taken notice that this story does not end well. And for the concubine, again, she's divided up into 12 pieces. But she is from the area of Bethlehem, which is in Judah. And out of Bethlehem, of course, is going to come King David. And so the dynasty of David comes forth out of Bethlehem. So everything is connected to the temple. So the king in the temple, the Levites serving in the temple, it's all about the house of God. It's all about building the house of God. It's all about when Israel corrupts the house of God, what he does when they do that. And typically an enemy would come in and either destroy the temple and send them into exile, or they might live in the land and be oppressed by a foreign entity. So for the northern tribes, the Assyrians came. They did leave some of them behind, but they took many of them and spread them out throughout the Assyrian Empire. In the case of Babylon, which King Nebuchadnezzar came against Jerusalem, he took the best and the brightest with him, but he left people behind. And those that he took were in some serving like Daniel in the courts of Nebuchadnezzar. So from Micah, it tells us, but you, Bethlehem, now Bethlehem means house of bread. And to my mind, this has something to do with a particular piece of furniture that is in the holy place. And that piece of furniture, we have a table, we call it the table of showbread, the shulchan lechem hapanim. And the table on it were 12 loaves of bread. So this is important. These 12 loaves of bread represented the presence of God, the literal presence of God. Now, there's a whole backstory as well behind those loaves. I can't go into it in a lot of detail right now. But those loaves were switched out every Shabbat. They were laid out one Shabbat, and the following they would be switched out. But the ones that were removed from the table were the ones that were eaten. And it's very interesting that the high priest would eat 5 of those loaves, and the remaining 7 went to the priests on Shabbat. And so we have a story in there. You'll recall David came into the temple, and he was hungry, and he was with his men, and he was given 5 loaves of bread to eat. He was given those 5 loaves of the bread of the presence, and he was acting out a role coming of king and high priest, which that was something fairly normal in the ancient world. These ancient kings ruled as king and high priest, but it wasn't the case in Israel through a long period of time. Those 2 roles were separated. But David, in his kingdom dynasty, is making a statement by eating those 5 loaves. So it tells us, but you, Bethlehem, near, so small among the clans of Judah. Out of you will come forth to me the future ruler of Israel, whose origins are far in past. So of course we know Yeshua comes out of Bethlehem. And we know Ruth, who left Moab with Naomi, ends up in Bethlehem, and of course she's the mother of the dynasty of King David. So this Bethlehem is going to represent the power elites, the kings. Now, Saul was not from this area, he was from the tribe of Benjamin. But once we get to David, the kingdom, the kingship is all going to take us back to Bethlehem once again. And of course, that's the place where the concubine's from. So it's important because she represents the power elites in Israel who have sold out. They have become corrupt. And by the time we get to the Second Temple period, they are serving. They have become very corrupt. In particular, the high priest, who's not even from the tribe that he's from the house of Aaron. So let me just read this as well. This is from the Jerusalem Talmud in Berchot 2:4. Very interesting. It says, selling his cow and plow, he buys some swaddling cloth and travels from town to town. He travels to Bethlehem, where the child is born. The child is surely the Messiah who will rebuild the temple. Now, we all know, well, of course, it's talking about Yeshua the Messiah, but the Talmud is not speaking of Yeshua, it's speaking of King David. So, and King David isn't actually the one that built the temple, his son Solomon was, but he was the child that was born and the Messiah. And so the royal line of David takes us all the way through to Messiah, who would ultimately be king. It tells us, thus is in keeping with the teachings of our sages. In every generation is born a descendant of Judah, Yehuda, who is worthy to become Israel's Moshiach. Now that's a different word than Mashiach. Mashiach is anointed, Moshiach is Savior. When the time will come, God will reveal himself to him and send him, and the spirit of Moshiach, which is hidden and secreted on high, will be revealed in him. So remember, we're in the time of the judges, and all these judges are supposed to be deliverers and saviors. So each one of the judges can have the title of Moshiach, the one sent to deliver and save. But here we're talking about this one that would come from Judah, that would save. And of course, it begins dealing with David, but we understand as the generations go down that it is manifested in the life of Yeshua the Messiah, that God will reveal himself to him and send him along with the Spirit. And so things will be revealed through him. But I just thought that was very interesting because that's from a rabbinic source. And so we can see the tie there. Now, in talking about the concubine as representing the power elites, perhaps the priests, perhaps the dynasty, the kingship, etc., Yeshua has something to say about them. So by the time we get to the Second Temple period, as I mentioned earlier, the temple itself had become corrupt through the leadership. The leadership that was serving the high priest was not from the line of Aaron. In particular, we have a guy named Ananias, you might remember, and he installs his family members. So Caiaphas ends up serving for quite a long period of time as high priest, from about 18 of the Common Era to 36, probably the longest serving. They were in league with the Romans. There's bribery, graft, extortion. The Romans are selling off the high priesthood as well. And so it is not functioning as it was supposed to. It is to those people that Yeshua is making statements and addressing them about their father of lies. So let's read this in John chapter 8. And he says, I know that you are Abraham's seed. So we got that. I'm saying what I have seen from the Father, but you are doing what you heard from your father. So we got a different father here. Remember the concubine going to Bethlehem to her father's house, and she is the harlot. Because you are not able to hear my message, you are from your father, the devil, and you want to do the desires of your father. that one was a murderer from the beginning, and he has not stood in the truth because the truth is not in him. So he's talking to the power elites of the day, and he is challenging them. So yeah, you're from Abraham's seed, but he is accusing their father of being the devil himself, and of being led, and being almost comparing them to being murderers. So he is addressing real people in real time, and he's addressing the problems that are taking place in the house of God. See, everything goes back to the house of God, whether we're dealing with the tabernacle or the temple or the tabernacle in Shiloh or whatever it is. The Bible is consistently dealing with that structure. Of course, if we're moving on and saying that we're the people of God, we're the house of God, we're the temple of the Lord, do you not think he's going to deal with us in the same way? So we're not exempt from this. Are we not right saying that you are a Samaritan yourself and you have a demon? Because now they're accusing him. And Yeshua answered, I do not have a demon, but I honor my Father, and you dishonor me. And so here, this is in the language of the ancient Near East world, honor and shame language. So by honoring one, you dishonor or shame another. Are you greater than our father Abraham, who died? So he's challenging them once again. So it's interesting, too, that they're saying that Yeshua is from Shomron or Samaria, the area of Ephraim. So if you'll recall, that's the place where Jeroboam came on the scene. Actually, he set up 2 calves, one in Bethel and one in Dan. That is the area of the northern tribes that were taken into captivity by the Assyrians, worshiping following the setup that Jeroboam had arranged for the people. And now they're accusing him of having a demon. So that's pretty much how they were viewing that bunch up north. So the concubine's house is the temple leadership under the dominion of the adversary's kingdom. That's the nature of what is going on in this story. So again, she goes to her father's house, and now the Levite comes to take her out of that scenario and back to Shiloh. So it tells us, I thought also very interesting, tucked away in the story, that her father, representing again the temple leadership, restrains the Levite for 3 days to prevent him from leaving. I just put that out there. I thought that was kind of interesting. I'm not making an assumption here, but this imagery that's tucked in here of Yeshua, perhaps three days and 3 nights in the earth, restrained, if you will, in the earth before he sets up the kingdom. But we have this constant battle between 2 kingdoms. It's the kingdom that's represented by the temple structure, God's house, and the environment, the empire, I hate to use that word, dealing with Israel, but all the other versus all the other empires outside of Israel that they constantly have to keep battling, empires that keep coming against them, oppressing them, kings that target their own temple because they know if the king comes in and destroys that temple or takes the throne of that temple, he, in his mind, has beaten God himself. And so all of this continues to go on. He stayed there on the 4th day. It tells us that he had some kind of covenant meal with the family. But at that point, on the 4th day, it's time to leave Bethlehem, take his concubine, and return back to Shiloh. So on their way back, they're going to pass through Jerusalem. It's in the evening. There's no place for them to lodge. At that time, it's called Jebus. And again, they're on the road back to Shiloh, no place to stay. Now, at this particular point, Jerusalem, Jebus, they have not, Benjamin has not pushed out the enemy. And so at this point, Jebus is basically controlled by foreigners. And again, that message is kind of one of the key messages throughout the Bible, is how the foreigners always target Jerusalem. Why do they always target Jerusalem? Because that is the throne of God. And if whoever has the throne wins. So they would always go in and they would target the throne of the king that sat and ruled and reigned from that place. Israel's king ruled and reigned from Jerusalem, in particular on Mount Moriah in the temple. And so, yeah, that's the place that the foreign oppressors are always going to try to take hold of. Now, when we come to the time of Yeshua, who are the foreign oppressors? Well, that's going to be Rome. And so a lot of the language that we have in the book of Revelation, speaking of beasts and things like that, is dealing with Rome. Rome has oppressed Israel for quite some time. The Caesar is in fact described as the beast, the seven-headed beast that comes out of the seas, is a metaphor for the Gentile kingdoms. So the Gentile kingdoms functioned outside of the temple environment. They were outside the camp. The seas were said to represent that place outside the place where there was dry ground. The dry ground signified temple. And so out in the seas are these empires who are always coming against Israel to take the throne so that they can replace God, who is supposed to be seated on the throne. And this is the environment we have for centuries with Yeshua and the Romans ruling and reigning over Jerusalem. So, going back to the Levites, and they're on their way, they're trying to get to Shiloh, stopping off in Jerusalem. There's no place to stay there. So they go to Givah in the area of Benjamin, because they're in that tribal area, and they sit down in a town square. So while they're sitting there waiting, I guess, for someone to come along, the translation is an old man, which is really not a good translation, because the Hebrew tells us it was a zakan, who is an elder. And it says that he came from his work in the field. Now, if you understand temple language, you'd understand that the field is actually one of the idioms for part of the temple complex. So every temple in the ancient world, Mesopotamia, would have the temple, they would have a ziggurat, and they would have a garden. And the king would grow all kinds of wonderful things and make these beautiful gardens that kind of look like English country estates. But connected to the garden as well would be an area would be the field. Best way to describe it would be, let's say we're at Mount Sinai. So you've got the mountain, and the mountain is a picture of the temple. On top of the mountain represented the inner sanctum, the Holy of Holies, the place where Moses went into the cloud. The rest of the way down the mountain would be representative of the garden, and that is, of course, the place where the priests would serve. And so we know in that story when the children of Israel are at the foot of the mountain, halfway up we've got the elders there. So this is mountains and temples are one and the same in the ancient world. And then at the bottom of the mountain is where all the folks are, and that would be considered the field. So it was in the field, if you will, that would be the location of an altar. The altar would be in the field, and that is what this is saying, that the Zakan, he came from his work, his service, Avodah, and likely in Shiloh. It's not clear here, not sure. But when he's working in the field, that is telling us that he's doing something within the temple environment and perhaps working in the area of where the offerings took place. And so he sees them sitting on the bench, and he's like, where are you coming from? Where are you walking from? Where are you going? It's kind of like spirit language. Where did you come from? Where are you going? And so the Zakan invites the Levite and his concubine into his house, and he does the hospitality of the host. He washes his feet, and they go in and they eat and they drink. And this is very much in keeping with the covenant language, was what you would do in a temple. There was a lot of eating and drinking that went on in the temple, because they lived there and that's how things functioned. So all of the offerings were meals. They were either for Levites, for priests, or for the folks. And even the burnt offering, for example, was the food, was God's food. So that entire temple offering was about eating and drinking. So we have the Zakan taking the Levite and the concubine into his home. Perhaps his home represented some kind of sanctuary. We don't really know for sure. But I'm trying to show you that all of this language tucked into this story has everything to do with temple language. And because the whole of the Bible is about this. It is the whole construct of the temple and the house and the people that serve in the house and the hierarchy of those various ones that serve. And so here in this story, we're dealing with the leadership that is causing problems that ripple down into the rest of the community. This story, in many ways, is a retelling of the story of Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah as you read it. It's kind of interesting, and there's no question it's picking up on that particular story. Now, that story would have been well known for the folks going back to Abraham. So they would have, as they heard it, they could not help but take notice of the similarity. Of course, the players are a little different in the story that we have here with the Zakan. So it tells us in the narrative that the lawless ones surround the house of the Zakan, and the lawless ones are from the tribe of Benjamin. And the house was always, if you think about the temple, was the demarcation between cultures, between Israel and its God and that cultural norm, and then the nations outside. And it was also a division it was a separation between that which was clean and unclean. And not in the terms of something's dirty, you gotta wash it and clean it, but that language is in terms of status, spiritual status. So those inside the house had a particular status in relationship to God, and those outside the house did not have that relationship. So what is also interesting to me is that inside the house, the Zakan has a virgin daughter. So now we got the harlot, the concubine, and we got the virgin daughter, both in this house. So another idiom for the temple, and actually for Jerusalem herself, is the virgin daughter. So the daughter who is pure, undefiled bride that goes with the bridegroom, which is speaking about the entire community of Israel in that formal sense. Anytime you read a virgin daughter of Israel, or speaking about the virgin daughter in some ways, is speaking about the pure bride, which is the temple. You see the exact same thing in the book of Revelation. And yes, as a physical structure, but even more so, it's talking about the people. This concept of the people as a temple goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 1. And because we don't even understand the nature of temples and how they function and what God does in them and why He's there and all the various responsibilities of the people and how He sees it as a house and how He sees a husband and wife building a house, He sees the temple and Israel the exact same way. So again, there's so much language in here dealing with the temple. So she's sent outside the house, the harlot is, the Benjamites want, bring her down, and the Zakan is ready to send out his virgin daughter, just like we have in the story of Lot. However, the Levite sends out his concubine, and of course it's a very graphic tale. She's abused all night, and she's just ravished by the Benjamites, and it's a graphic story of her rape and abuse. Again, it's a metaphor, and it's talking about the destruction of her flesh by ones that are in the camp of Israel. It tells us, now we see in the morning dawn is breaking, and she's fallen at the threshold, which is very significant because, and we'll probably talk about this in more detail in our next show, talking about thresholds and doorways and gateways and what that meant to the ancient world. It doesn't mean the same to us. We don't have to think twice about crossing over a threshold. But the threshold was the place where the covenant was made. So, for example, a covenant meal would be made in the gateway, in the doorway. Now, in the temple, we're used to 3-4 inch thresholds. When we cross over again, we don't bat an eyelash. But, for example, in the second temple, the gateways and the entryways were gigantic. They were 30, 50, 100 feet just to get from one end to the other. As I said, we're going to get more into that in the next program. So Dawn's breaking, and she's fallen at the entrance to the door of the house. And it tells us the master. Now it's talking in terms of master instead of Levi. Also very interesting. He opens the door. It's totally bizarre. I guess he looks down, and there's this woman lying in the doorway. It's like he just steps over her like nothing happened. But there's something very significant in what's said there. And again, we don't see it in English, but you see it in Hebrew. And it said that she had reached her hand back to the threshold. So it was that her hand was touching the threshold. And we're going to talk about how significant that is and how there's a sort of a covenant aspect to this and how thresholds were very important. So as we close out this session, we just remember that the Zakon's house, the elder's house, if it represented sort of the temple pattern, and this is true for us, so we don't have a physical temple, but the body of Messiah is supposed to function in the same way as the house of God. And that is that it's a place of safety, a place of security, it's a place of provision, and it's a place that is separated from the outside forces. So it's a place where we are separated out from hostile forces that would come against us. So within the temple environment, this is the place where new life comes forth. This is the place that is your provision. Again, we don't have a physical standing temple right now, but the body of Messiah is supposed to function in exactly that way. It is supposed to be a safe place. It's supposed to be a set-apart place. It's supposed to be a transformational place. It is supposed to be very different from a culture outside that. So it doesn't matter whether you're in Texas or you're in Indonesia. If you're part of the body, it's supposed to function. It is a functional body. We focus too much on what it's supposed to do, but what is its purpose? And for those within the body, it is supposed to bring all these things, safety and security and provision, and it is supposed to be separate and different from anything else. So we're going to close out this program here, and I really hope that you can see tucked away in this language, the similarities and again, the language of the temple. And because that's the place of God's presence. That's where we want to be. We want His presence in the midst of us. And we want, ultimately, God's presence came into Yeshua, who should be our Messiah and our temple functioning that way. So we'll see you next time. Thanks for joining me, Shalom.